Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. We have filmmaker Kevin Macdonald with us today. We'll chat with Kevin in just a moment, but first, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post in our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please follow or subscribe and rate and review, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So, Kevin Macdonald is a Scottish-born filmmaker who's worked across feature films, documentary, and television over the last 25 years. His best-known films include One Day in September, Touching the Void, The Last King of Scotland, Life in a Day, MARLEY, Whitney, The Mauritanian, and his new film, 1:1, John and Yoko, which premiered at Venice and Telluride in 2024 and opens exclusively in IMAX April 11th. Kevin is also the co-author of Imagining Reality, The History of Documentary Film. Kevin, welcome into the back room.
Nice to be here.
So I am really excited to talk with you about the new film, which is called 1:1, John and Yoko. But I want to go back in time a bit because I think people's childhoods is so important, as it's often a reflection of who they've become and the work they do when they get older. So tell me about you as a little kid. What were you like?
That's a really hard question. Not one I was expecting to answer. Well, I grew up in Scotland, in the countryside, basically on a farm. My father had a sheep farm, but that was only because he also had a sheepskin tannery, which is a kind of, I guess, an unusual profession these days. But he had a tannery, and my family were either in the sort of agricultural business or they were in the film business. I had a grandfather and an uncle who were in the film business.
Okay.
And so I had that element as well, even though I grew up in the middle of nowhere. And I don't think I never kind of got a job with either of them or anything like that. But I think it gave me the sense that, oh, maybe, being in film is something you can do.
Oh, that's interesting. This is why I love asking this question, because at the same time of growing up on a farm in Scotland, you can also have exposure to the arts and film. And obviously you became a filmmaker. So it's interesting when you explore that connective tissue. And so when did you get bitten by the film bug in terms of, this is something I may want to do for myself?
Well, I didn't really ever think I'd be in film. I thought I wanted to be a journalist, and I studied English literature at university, and I tried to get a job or an internship or something as a journalist in the early 1990s in London, and couldn't get one, and kind of did a little bit of freelancing and, didn't do a lot. But then actually what happened was that, oh, here comes my dog who's decided to interrupt. Hang on. So come on.
Oh, we love interviewing dogs too.
Yeah. That'll happen. Yeah, she'll be back again, I'm sure. Yeah, so I was trying to be a journalist, couldn't get a job, started making little fun videos on Hi8 camera, which is the first kind of, semi-decent, very flexible home video camera that, had quite good picture quality. I mean, today it looks horrendous, but or has a certain charm. But anyway, I started making little videos on that, little documentaries that were like 7 or 10 minutes long. Some of them were quite sort of comedic. And I had a friend who was an editor and cut them together. I also did them with my brother, who went on to be a film producer. And that was kind of my introduction. One of those films got seen by somebody at the BBC here in the UK, and they said, "Oh, do you want to? We'll give you £500. Go and make something for this show that we needed. We needed a video for." And one thing led to another, and I started getting work as a documentary maker, and then for a few years I worked on television documentaries about artists, and I made documentaries about filmmakers. I made a documentary about Errol Morris, amazingly.
Wow.
One of the first things I ever did was
it all recreation?
It was all recreation of his life. And I made a film about Howard Hawks, and I did a film about a guy called Donald Cammell, who made a great film I love called Performance with Nick Rogue. And so I did a film about an artist and all sorts of things. So then I started getting really interested in what would happen if you made a documentary for cinema, because I started to see in the mid 90s, we started to get these great American imports, When We Were Kings, Hoop Dreams, Crumb. These were the first films that I had seen, which were documentaries which really played in theaters and really made an impact in theaters. And I thought, I really want to do that. And so then I started casting around to say, what's a good subject to make a film that would work in the cinema, which is exciting and which has the kind of a cinematic element to it. And came across this story with a producer called John Batzik. We came across this story which turned into a film called One Day in September, which was about the Munich Olympic Games and the massacre at the Munich Olympic Games of the Israeli athletes. And there was a kind of, I was under the influence very much of Oliver Stone's JFK. I had this idea, I want to make a documentary that works like JFK, works like a thriller, like that film works, and has this sort of conspiratorial energy to it. But, I should point out that, Oliver Stone has become a conspiracy theorist, whereas I just like the conspiratorial tone.
Right. Layered with the actual truth.
So I made this film One Day in September, which went on to do very well, won the Oscar in 1999 for Best Documentary, 2000 actually, for Best Documentary. And that kind of started me off making feature documentaries, and that in the end led to me also doing fiction films.
Great story. And you mentioned Errol Morris, you mentioned Oliver Stone. Were there filmmakers in particular that inspired you back then?
Yeah, there's a handful of filmmakers who I really worship. And I think, Errol Morris is one of them, hugely influential on what I've done. So many of his ideas about character and about using interviews in a cinematic way, not in a journalistic way, there's been very influential on me. But there's also other filmmakers like the Maysles brothers and the classic observational filmmakers of the 60s and 70s who I think are, incredible. People like Marcel Offels, the filmmaker who made The Sorrow and the Pity and Hotel Terminus. Those films in the 60s and 70s are some of my all-time favorites as well, because they combine a kind of sense of humor with a journalistic rigor and a cinematic flair. And even filmmakers like Humphrey Jennings, which won't be a name that means anything to people in America, but who is a really poetic filmmaker in Britain during the war, actually. And he made, if people don't know his work at all, which they probably don't, they should look up a film that he made called Listen to Britain, which is like a 20-minute film about the sights and sounds of Britain at war in 1942. And it's a stunningly beautiful film. And I kind of ripped the idea that he had in that film off when I made a couple of films called Life in a Day. So there's one called Life in a Day in 2010, and one we then redid it in 2020, which are just sort of a collage of what's going on around the world on a single day. But the inspiration for that comes from this filmmaker, Humphrey Jennings.
All right, so let's talk about the film. And before we do, I just want to establish that I loved it. I'm a huge Beatles fan, a huge John Lennon fan. My late wife and I danced to Oh My Love at our wedding. And when I made my documentary about her life and death, I couldn't fathom making the film without being able to use that song. And I have a lot of appreciation and affection for Yoko because she so generously let me use that song in my film, which, as you know, would have been a fortune.
What a lovely thing.
Yeah, and as you know, the documentary music budgets aren't huge typically, so that was fantastic. But the film is an inside look into the 18 months that John and Yoko spent living in a small Greenwich Village apartment in the early 1970s and the one-to-one benefit concerts at Madison Square Garden on August 30th, 1972, which should be noted were John's first and only full-length post-Beatles live performances. So why did you want to make a film about John and Yoko, and what attracted you to this particular time in their lives?
Well, I have to be totally honest to say, somebody approached me and said, "I've got the rights to this concert.
That works.
And would you like to make a film about it?" But going a bit deeper than that, John meant a huge amount to me in my teenage years. I was 13 years old when he died. Obviously, I think it really, it's the period of your life when you're most obsessed with music. And
Hmm.
he suddenly entered the UK charts, and all his songs, all his albums came back, and so I was completely enamored of him and of the Beatles, and that was the music of my teenage years. Um, and then, I never thought, I'd get to make a film about him, or even sort of I thought there have been so many films about the Beatles, so
Right.
many films about John Lennon, so many books, so many articles. And so when actually Peter Worsley, who was the producer on this, approached me and said, you're interested in making a film about John Lennon, and around this concert that he did, that his concert's been, never properly seen, it's been remastered. And I was like, yeah, well, there's just been so many things. I don't know what I would do differently. And actually, I was offered a film to make about the Beatles. This about 10 years ago, which I didn't do because, by Apple Records. And I didn't do it because I thought, well, again, what is this to say? Because it's
Right.
new. But I then went to watch this concert, which I'd never seen. Previously, it only ever released on VHS in 1986. And so you can see clips of what it used to be, what the earlier version of this concert looked like on YouTube. And, it's pretty ropey. And that's the reason why it was never more widely disseminated by the estate, because I
Hmm.
don't think they felt that it was representative of what John would have wanted. Um, but with the advent of incredible sound technology in the last few years, sound has moved on so much. And Sean Lennon was able to remix and remaster the the audio from this concert and make it sound absolutely incredible, make it sound like you are there. And suddenly, what had seemed like a kind of you know a curiosity, but not a great piece of music, had became something extraordinary. And as you say, it's the only time that John gave a full length concert in his post Beatles career. And the Beatles stopped touring in 1966. So it's literally for the last 14, 15 years of his life, he didn't really play live, except one or two instances where he played that with Elton John, a couple of songs where he played here and there, a little bit on TV, but not very much. This is the only time he gave a full concert. And you realize when you watch the concert that he was incredibly fucking good. He was
Hmm.
amazing.
Hmm.
And so that was really the thing. I saw this concert. I thought, oh my God, this is like gold dust. This is incredible to see him at his height. And then I asked the question, why did this concert happen? And that sort of became the the kind of the quest that animated me and also the film. In a way, it's a kind of like it's a making of the concert in a way. It's about how did this concert come about, but it's in a way that's not, I guess, the normal kind of making of behind the scenes kind of film. It's really about the times. It's about
Hmm.
1972 when the concert happened, what was going on in their lives, in John and Yoko's lives, but also what was happening politically in America at the time and around the world. Um, and the film shows, I think, where emotionally this concert came from. And so it's simultaneously a music film and a very intimate film about John and Yoko in this particular kind of transformational period of their lives when they've just arrived from England. They're kind of escaping from the fallout from the Beatles, and they're trying to figure out, who are we? What do we do next? Where do we go? How do we use our fame? Um, and so we catch them in this moment where they're kind of, uncertain which way to turn. And that's a very interesting place to catch any artist, I think, when they're not, you know, they don't know what they want to do next. And they're
Hmm.
trying to figure it out. And there's a bit of confusion and a bit of um, uncertainty. And uncertainty, I think, is really appealing. And so, yeah, it's a film where you really get to spend intimate time with them, because I was lucky enough to get hold of these phone calls which they had recorded in their apartment at this time, where they're just chatting to their friends and chatting to their manager, and you really hear their voices in that period, and you get to understand their motivations. So yeah, it's a film with many different facets to it.
And the concert really does, in a way, serve as the anchor or spine of the film. And the charitable aspect of this concert was certainly admirable and important. But how significant was this show, do you think, to John personally in this enormous consequential transition to his post-Beatles life, where he's trying to become the next iteration of the Beatle John Lennon?
Well, the concert, when he did this concert, it was a flop. The critics hated it. The audiences apparently weren't really enthusiastic, although in the footage it looks like they're pretty enthusiastic. But I gather from things I've read about it that it didn't go down that well. And I think a lot of that is to do with the fact that the sound system was not well set up, and they weren't sufficiently rehearsed, perhaps, and that kind of thing. So I think it really was devastating to him. This was like the first time I think he'd experienced, hasn't played live in a big venue for 6 years. And he goes in and he sort of thinks, I'm a Beatle, everything I do is going to be, people are going to love it. And then they don't love it. And I think that caused him a lot of pain. But at the same time, of course, he's been campaigning out on the streets for the democratic cause, for progressive causes in the year of Nixon's re-election. So we're talking 1972, which is when obviously Richard Nixon is going for a second term. The Watergate scandal is already reared its head, but hasn't been enough to, nobody really understands what it's about, and they don't realize it's going to finish him off within a year or so. But so John is really engaged in politics. You see him out marching. You see him at the first International Feminist Conference. You see him taking phone calls from Irish Republican organizations and things. And so he's somebody who on the surface is really highly politicized. But I think that's also part of what's so appealing about him is that you feel this questing. You feel like, should I be using my fame to make the world a better place? How do I make the world a better place? Can I make a difference politically? And sometimes you feel like he comes across as incredibly naive when he's talking about what he can do to change the world.
Almost like a kid.
Almost like a kid, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that's also very appealing because there's a kind of there's an openness to him that sometimes, as you said, strays into naivety. But he's incredibly he's kind of receptive to people and to ideas, and you get the sense that anyone could phone him up or knock on his door, and he'd have a conversation with them and treat them as an equal. And it's also that one of the things I find fascinating, is that this period, they're living in a like 1-bedroom apartment or even a 1-room apartment, pretty much in the West Village at the time before the West Village, was the shishi place that it is now, and they've deliberately let go of the trappings of fame and celebrity and money, which they had in England. He had a huge country estate and a lake and swimming pools, tennis courts, and Rolls Royces. And they've left all that behind. It's all basically in mothballs, and they move into this pretty down market, a tiny apartment. And John talks in the film about how Yoko said to him, we should lead the 2 tatami life, and by which referring to the tatami mat. And her theory was that everyone just needs the space to have 2 tatami mats, and that's all you need in life. And so they're actually practicing that in a way. They're living in this tiny apartment. They're open to people coming into their lives. And so, yeah, it's this openness, I'd say, is the biggest thing I feel about John when I watch this film.
Yeah, and accessibility. It's interesting because here's one of the most famous people in the world at that time. And what I got from those moments in the film is that he really didn't quite take himself all that seriously, and he was accessible. One of my favorite stories that I've ever heard about Lennon, it came from Bob Gruen, who of course and is thanked in the film. I've interviewed him and become friends with him, and he was telling me that back in the day, around that time perhaps, that Lennon was coming to his loft in the West Village at Westbeth, which is this enormous, crazy, artistic, full square block kind of apartment building. And it's like a maze when you get in there. And Lennon gets in the building, and even though he has like the directions of how to get to Bob's apartment, he got lost. And he's just knocking on doors. And people are like, oh my God, John Lennon just knocked on my door. and they are inviting him in to like watch their kid get guitar lessons or whatever. So by the time he gets to Bob's apartment, Bob's like, "You're late. Like, what happened?" He goes, "Oh, I just was like in 5 different apartments watching this one get piano lessons, and this woman was cooking me spaghetti." And like he literally just experienced the residents of that building. And hearing that story just made you realize, like, here's this guy again, one of the most famous people in the world. And he just loved to just kind of experience shit.
Well, I think that's what's interesting, is that that's exactly the period that we're talking about with this documentary. And yet, you know, within a year or two, so after this period, he has his famous kind of alcoholic breakdown period, the Lost Weekend, as it's called, where he splits with Yoko, and he goes to LA, and you know, he has a pretty miserable time by all accounts of it. And then he comes back a year or so later and gets back together with Yoko, and they have a baby. There's Sean, and then he becomes this recluse, effectively. You know, he's just basically in the apartment. So this is a kind of unique little period where he is incredibly accessible, incredibly open. But I think, you know, the main thing they haven't talked about is that, you know, this film is formally quite different than other things that have been made about the Beatles, about Lennon. And that was part of the idea, was just to say, how do you make a film which doesn't include lots of talking heads and the same old kind of, you know, now very graying and increasingly few memoirists of this period. Where else do you get your information from? And so we were very lucky that because this period was a moment of great openness for him, he was recording his phone calls, making home videos, there's hours of home videos, which we have in the film. He's inviting film crews to all of these events. So there's a lot of stuff of him being filmed, a lot of stuff of him on the news, on TV chat shows. So it's actually, I think, the only moment in John's life where you could make a film like this, which is entirely archive based.
Yeah, you had great archival.
Yeah, it's amazing and I didn't actually know that when we started off, but I think that was the great revelation, I think.
Well, the film weaves together rare archival footage of John and Yoko and this incredible concert with news clips, TV commercials highlighting that very turbulent period. And in a way, the movie seems as much about America during those 18 months as it is about John and Yoko.
Yeah, I think it becomes that, because I think what the idea was that John and Yoko are sitting in their apartment, and what they do most of the time, although they are engaging with politics, engaging with musicians, they're watching TV. And John spoke a lot in interviews about how when he arrived in America, he loved just sitting down for hours and watching TV. And it was how he learned about the country. And so I had this idea, well, why don't we rebuild his apartment? So that's what we did. We made a set of the apartment, put his big TV, find the exact same TV he had, and we would watch TV with him, as it were. And so we're seeing the America that he is seeing. We're understanding America as he's understanding it through news clips, commercials, you know, music programs, whatever. And so a large part of this movie is, you know, there's the concert, there's all these home movies, and then there's, you know, what's going on TV in America. And what I realized is that as I started to look at the clips from this period, is that it seems like this is like a precursor of the America of 2024, 2025.
Sure.
It's so many things are similar. It was kind of became quite spooky. You know, whether it be, you know, the division on the campuses with a foreign war, obviously in those days, Vietnam, and now with Israel and Gaza, or whether it be, you know, a controversial white nationalist politician, George Wallace, who gets shot on camera, or whether it be Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman to run for president. So I began to feel like, oh my God, this is like a repeat, 50 years later, repeat of some of these same ideas, these same themes.
Yeah,
that were resonant then. They're back again.
But one huge takeaway from the film, for me, given what you just said, was how I feel like we are missing today the kind of passionate, dedicated, outspoken, and courageous anti-war, anti-violence peace activists that John and Yoko were. I mean, we could sure use voices like that and that kind of presence, again, given the quote unquote revolution that needs to be taking place right now, with all the things you mentioned.
Yeah, more than them just being peace activists, I think that they are just politically engaged.
Yeah, well, they gave a shit. They gave a shit about a lot of
they
stuff.
gave a shit, and they're really putting themselves on the line. And I think when I've shown the film to much younger audiences, people in their teens and early 20s, who don't really know anything about this period, who don't even know anything about John and Yoko, the thing that they have all said is, wow, these celebrities, they're not like celebrities now. These people really were, they were not just answering their own phones, but they were out on the manning the barricades, they were marching, they were putting their money where their mouth is, and they were leading this incredibly simple, non-materialistic life. And there's something really inspiring about that, and a sense of deep commitment and authenticity, which is really missing today.
Yeah. I love the use of the cultural and political footage because to me, the backdrop of Nixon and Watergate and the Vietnam War presents in the film kind of a good versus evil character thing, like with Nixon as the warmongering anti-hero to John's populist, peace-loving hero.
Mm. Well, I think they're certainly set in opposition, and I think Nixon is the antagonist of the film, but we tried to do something a little amusing with Nixon, which was whenever we see him, he's always presented either playing music or listening to music or being treated like a rock star. So we tried to do this funny blending of kind of, John is always being political and Nixon is always dancing or listening to music or whatever, to make it a little more lighthearted, I suppose.
Another big takeaway for me was the reminder for people that Yoko actually had what I feel is a terrific singing voice. She had great range, and that she was a true pioneer when it came to singing. In my opinion, she was the original punk. And unfortunately, she never got the credit that I think she deserves, and was instead mocked, for her style.
Yeah, I think you see in the film her doing both ends of her spectrum. There's a beautiful clip of her and John, a home movie clip of them sitting in their apartment singing a song called "Luck of the Irish," and they sing together, and
it was beautiful.
She's singing harmony, and it's absolutely beautiful.
Yeah,
and very, very crisp and clean and classical harmony singing. It's really pretty. And then which is not a word you associate with Yoko's singing. Then you see her singing a song about her missing daughter, who, the story of her missing daughter is a big part of the film, obviously, Kyoko. And you see her singing this song, "Don't Worry, Kyoko," and it's her screaming and screeching and just kind of letting out her frustration, her anger. Yeah, it's totally visceral. And I think what you realize, and you see those two things in proximity, is that, these, both of these are performances, and when she's screaming and shouting and screeching, that is a performance. There's a sort of, in the same way as you're saying, punk is a kind of deliberate attitude. It's not about musicality necessarily. It's about an attitude and about an emotional communication. And so I hope people will watch the film and realize, understand what Yoko was doing a little better and cut her a bit of slack.
And the same could be said about John. I mean, your film does a great job of showcasing his range, and in particular with Mother, which is just, I think, one of the most powerful songs he's ever sung about his own upbringing and his pain. But the screaming that he does in that film is kind of a similar thing that Yoko does. And so during that period, I think they both, he in particular, I guess, was exploring that kind of extreme range in his voice to convey emotion.
Well, I think it came for both of them. Yeah, I think for both of them, this came out of their experience with Primal Scream, which was this kind of psychotherapeutic movement of the late 60s, early 70s, which John really embraced. They both embraced for a while, which is, you have to let out your inner child by crying and by screaming. And he got very into that. And I think that was the inspiration, I think, for what he does in Mother. and it's so moving, isn't it? And yeah, I think the idea of childhood and of the pain of childhood is really central to the documentary. In a way, that's what I see the film as being about. It's about John coming to terms with his own painful childhood and as he says, the chip on his shoulder that he's been left with after it, and Yoko coming to terms with losing her child and asking her the question, was I a bad mother? Was this child kidnapped because I wasn't, present enough? Is she happier without me? And there's a moment at the end of the film where she sings this song, Age 39, and she says, she talks about committing suicide, and she talks about, how neurotic she was as a mother. And that's I think why when they both watched the news report about the Willowbrook Children's for disabled kids, and they saw these horrendous conditions that these poor children being kept under, that they both responded so viscerally to that and decided we want to do a concert to benefit these children, and which is ultimately the revelation, I suppose, of the documentary, is that you realize late on that they haven't done this concert for political reasons. They haven't done it for even musical reasons. They've done it to raise money for these kids. Yeah. And I think sort of the idea of the inner child is really central to the film.
The film was made with the cooperation of John's estate, and Sean collaborated with you on the film. I would imagine what a gift that must have been to be able to work with him on this project.
Yeah, I mean, he was fantastic. And to be honest, I hardly had anything to do with him, which is often really, a great way to collaborate with somebody who has a load of material and who is so intimately connected to this, obviously, because it's his family. In a way, you don't want them to be there every day looking at what you're doing and asking questions, because, of course, they're going to look at it very different than you. But, Sean was incredibly straightforward to deal with. I pitched the idea of the film, a slightly sort of out there kind of conception of how I would do it. And he just said, oh, that sounds like a film my mother would love. Do it. And then we had a 10-minute call. And then I met him when we finished the film, and I showed him the film and we discussed it. And he said, you really captured my mother. This is the film that really, if you want to understand her, you see this film. And we had a couple of discussions about, some of the imagery and some of the mixes on the music, and that was it. And he's been very supportive and really, really lovely, but very hands off. And I think that's been really, really great to be trusted by him and to be able to be given all this incredible home movie footage and archive and just allowed to get on with it. So yeah, it was a very, very happy collaboration.
I know people probably ask you a lot, what do you want audiences to take away from the film? But I'd rather do a little bit of a twist on that and just ask you, what do you hope people feel when they watch this film?
Well, on one level, what I hope people feel is that even if they know nothing about John and Yoko or don't care for them, that they feel like, oh, these are two really interesting people, and this is a really interesting period, which I'm living through with them. But also, I kind of feel like I want people to look at the film and make their own story. I think so many documentaries tell the audience what to think in a way, particularly these kind of archival-based films about stars, about music celebrities or whatever. And we very consciously made a film where it's kind of make your own story. This is a kind of collage film, and you can see in it what you will to a great degree. I think I was really attracted to the idea that we got given all of these amazing artifacts, audio, photographs, home movies, and all this stuff, and none of them together make a complete story. They don't tell you who John and Yoko were, but within them are all these beautiful shards, and I wanted to present all these beautiful shards with as little interference as possible, in a way, and say, what do you make of these? What does this make you think about John and Yoko? What does this make you think about those times? And but at the same time, make a film that's entertaining. And unfortunately for that, I'm lucky enough to have one of the funniest men who ever lived. I think John is so hilarious and so quick-witted, and at every moment you're entertained by him.
I think you achieve those goals. And certainly for me, that's what I was able to experience watching the film. I was able to sort of see it through a lens that I felt was mine. And I did learn things that I didn't know before. And that's what a great documentary does. So congratulations on that achievement. And once again, the film is 1-to-1, John and Yoko, and it opens in IMAX on April 11th. I wish you a lot of success with the film. And I hope we get a chance to chat again someday.
Thank you very much. Really nice to talk to you.
All righty, take care. This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Matty Rosenberg and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Lengyel. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.